Kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije
evening, everybody, and welcome along. Or I should say good afternoon, in actual fact, force of habit there. Welcome along to the stream on Monday, the 15th of April, 2024. It is just past the hour of 3 p.m. in perfidious Albion, and we are here today to talk about the Iranian retaliatory strikes on the land known as Israel, but in actual fact is occupied Palestine. So we'll get to that in just a moment. Until then, I will just do some customary greetings. We are live just on YouTube and X or Twitter at the moment, due to the fact that Rumble is playing up again. I'm convinced that it's the British government doing something to interfere in Rumble's functioning inside Britain, because it only seems to work for a VPN now. So again, a problem I hope to resolve fairly soon. But we will say good afternoon to those who are here so far. So we have C. Bolt, who is with us, and who says it will be slow then sudden. Very true. Grassy Knoll says, hello, an open-minded greetings from Seattle, Washington to all. Well, better that than a closed-minded one. Otis says, good afternoon. Unfortunately, I have to catch this one later, but hope you're all well. Solidarity, brothers and sisters, workers of the world unite, indeed. Comradely greetings back to Svetlana, who joins us from Moscow. Eamon O'Sullivan joins us from Cork. Good to have you with us. Lee joins us as well, as does Not a Pacifist, who's coming to us at 10 a.m. in the morning in the eastern USA. Putin's shirt is with us, as is Jeremy Turner, and Ross joins us from Glasgow, or Port Glasgow, I should say. I'm not sure if that's actual Glasgow or another place called Port Glasgow. Maybe you could confirm. Guy joins us from Brazil. Hopes to convince your boss to watch live in the future. Well, if you can persuade the management to let you watch at work, that's always good. Munis, good morning to you, I think it will be, in your part of the world. Jawad, hello. Geli Nikolov joins us from Bristol, or Brizzle, as an old housemate of mine at university used to call it. Jerry is with us from Hampshire, I assume. And we also have Yuan joining us. And joining us from Phoenix, Arizona, we have Sammy joining us from a windy Lincolnshire. Apparently Garland Nixon can't get his stream to work on Rumble either. Yeah, there's probably some state interference there, I would guess. But we will, of course, begin the discussion today by talking about the Iranian retaliatory action on the state of Israel, which squats in occupied Palestine. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the series of events that led up to this, on April the 1st, the Israelis bombed via missile strike the Iranian consulate in Damascus, and they killed, depending upon which report you read, at least 16 Iranian personnel, including 7 officers of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, including some quite senior officers. And this was done, as I say, on April the 1st. And so it has taken 2 weeks almost. So it was the 13th, the evening of the 13th, when these strikes on Israel took place. There's a 2-week gap there when the Iranians tried to get the UN Security Council to address the behavior of Israel. I should be doing inverted commas around that title, as the resistance forces do, but to no avail. Because, of course, the British and the Americans and the French aren't going to let Israel be criticized at all via the UN, certainly not by Iran. And David Cameron gave a wonderful demonstration today on Sky News of the attitudes of imperialism when it came to the standards that are in place, or not in place, I should say, for the imperialist countries and for those who are in opposition to them, and with regard to the actions that the imperialists regard you as being able to take if you are attacked. Now, before we go any further, I am going to share this with you because it is absolutely hilarious. You couldn't have come up with a better definition of the arrogance of imperialism than David Cameron. So let's see if we can get this loading up here.
Wondered, well, you know, what is the true nature of Iran?
Right, let's just pull that back. So this is David Cameron, Lord Cameron, today on Sky News, and this was tweeted out by
a reckless and dangerous thing for Iran to have done. And I think the whole world can see all these countries that have somehow wondered, well, you know, what is the true nature of Iran? It's there in black and white.
What would Britain do if a hostile nation flattened one of our consulates?
Well, we would take the very strong action.
And as you can see, it ends with the traditional comedic rendition of the old Curb Your Enthusiasm theme. And I showed that because it's a rather short clip and it perfectly demonstrates the contortions and the arrogance of imperialism here. As Cameron says in that clip, if a British embassy was flattened, I'm quite surprised that the Sky News journalist actually asked him this, but she quite correctly asked him the question, well, what would Britain do if one of its embassies was flattened? And he says, oh, we'd take the strongest action. And therein he reveals the scam here, which is that if you are a nation which is inside the club, or more specifically, if you're in the G7 nations, the G7 nations are the best representation as a group of the US imperialist bloc. That is the inner core of the US imperialist bloc. It's the US itself, its longtime British ally or servant these days, if you prefer. And of course, then you have France, Italy, Germany, Japan, and Canada. And the whole question over what is allowed and what isn't allowed has to be viewed through this lens, which is that if, as Cameron says, if you attacked a British embassy, or never mind a US embassy, if a nation was to do what Israel did to Iran, which is, say, if Iran bombed the US embassy in let's just say Lebanon, for instance, via an air attack, then it would be the case that the Americans would use it as the pretext for some kind of large-scale military action almost immediately. But Iran's not allowed to do it because the implication in Cameron's words is that Iran isn't allowed to conduct itself in the same way as the real countries do, as the powerful countries do, and not just Iran either. You can apply this to Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Lebanon itself, even though it's ruled by various different shades of comprador, or anybody who's not in the big club isn't allowed to behave in such a way, isn't allowed to respond to attacks upon them. And the Iranians, quite correctly, cited a couple of pieces of international law with regards to the reasons why they took the action that they did. They cited Article 51 of the UN Charter. I'll just share with you now so you can see it. There we go. So Article 51, as you can see here, it's highlighted down the bottom of the page. So, reads as follows. Nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations, till the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. Measures taken by members in the exercise of this right of self-defense shall be immediately reported to the Security Council and shall not in any way affect the authority and responsibility of the Security Council under the present Charter to take at any time such action as it deems necessary in order to maintain or restore international peace and security. So that's on the UN website there. So the question here is, well, is this of any relevance whatsoever? And the answer is, well, most of the time, no, because as David Cameron has just revealed, there is no such thing as international law, not really. The whole system that was put in place there after World War II is by now, in fact, always was a joke. The way in which it was constructed was designed to look as if it was this bold new dawn for settling international disputes, but was in reality a complicated piece of what you might call liberal utopianism, which was there principally to act as conflict management at a time when the US had to take the Soviet Union in particular seriously after World War II. And after that, after the departure of the Soviet Union from the international stage, any usage of the United Nations became strictly for propaganda purposes. I mean, it never restrained truly the actions of the US imperialists. And for all the motions passed through both the Security Council and the General Assembly regarding Israel, nothing was ever really done about it. I mean, they're useful to cite when it comes to propaganda purposes, and that's exactly why they are cited now. Nothing to do with anybody ever expecting the UN Security Council or the UN as an entity to actually act on the behalf of the oppressed of the world. So the other citation the Iranians used in a letter to Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, was, of course, they cited the Vienna Convention, which, of course, recognizes the sovereignty of the nation concerned over their diplomatic premises in any particular country. So an attack on the Iranian consular building in Damascus is as good as an attack on Iran itself. And that's regarded through long-standing convention as being a key part of international relations. So the other thing that the Iranians cited was, of course, Article 2 of the United Nations, Article 2, subsection 4, which says, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. So again, like the validity of that and the usefulness of that is at best contested. But again, this is supposedly the framework of international law and international relations that is supposed to bind everybody, including those who are Israel's backers. And of course, they allowed this attack on the consular building to go ahead. I don't buy for a second that the US didn't know it was coming. Of course they did. I suspect that they know everything that goes on inside these Israeli meetings because they most likely have assets at various different levels inside the Israeli armed forces who report back to them on every key decision. But they, of course, had to deny it. So the question as to, well, what happens now has to be addressed. So just let me adjust something here. Right. So the other point to make before we get to the attack itself is that the Iranians waited 2 weeks and waited to see, first of all, if the US imperialists would in any way condemn what the Israelis had done. They didn't. The Russians did, the Chinese did, various other countries in the region, even the Saudis did. But of course, the usual language came from the US and the British and others, which was that, well, you know, that Iran shouldn't escalate, despite the fact that it was the Israelis that carried out the escalation. Now, the bombing of the consular building was, of course, not an act of strength, but an act of desperation. An act of desperation because, as we can all see now from the footage that's come out of Gaza, not only is it the case that the Israelis are not winning in terms of the battles that they've been having with the resistance forces in Gaza, but they've been losing far more men than they're willing to admit to, and they're getting hit with ambushes in places like Khan Yunis, where they've claimed to have control over it for months, and yet the resistance forces are still able to pop out of the ground, hit the Israelis with what appear to be very well structured operations. The Electronic Intifada ran a very interesting piece just a couple of days ago on the complexity of the Palestinian National Liberation Forces military operations against the Israeli forces in Gaza, and they hit the Israeli occupiers with a very effective ambush last week, which came just before the Israeli withdrawal from Khan Yunis, where they killed at least 10 Israeli ground forces, and that's just the numbers that have been admitted to so far. So clearly they haven't compromised the abilities of the Palestinians to move through the tunnel network. It's still very effective in terms of planning ambushes, and it's still very effective in terms of the ability to catch the Israelis completely unawares. So this great big operation that they've been engaged in, all the killing that they've done, and all the loud noises they've been making about how they're beating Hamas, well, it turns out not to be the case. It turns out not to be true. It turns out that they not only can they not fight, because as we've covered before, the Israeli army isn't used to actually fighting anybody. It's used for brutalizing civilians, torturing people, murdering people. Doesn't take a lot of bravery to spray off a load of bullets at unarmed civilians from an automatic weapon or a semi-automatic weapon, or kidnap people and brutalize them in dungeons, which is, again, all the stuff that they do. So they're not used to actually having to fight anybody. This myth of Israeli invincibility is based principally on the 1967 war, where they launched an attack on the various different forces around the Middle East, and managed to knock out certainly the Egyptian Air Force very quickly, claiming it was a preemptive assault. There's severe doubts over whether there was any real Egyptian and Syrian plan to actually strike at Israel now, and this is now looking like that was a lie. But it's based on that, and it's based on a lot of propaganda about the effectiveness of the wondrous nature of Mossad, which is essentially just a smaller version of the CIA and MI6, which specializes in murdering people and committing acts of terror. And they are quite proficient at that, but not very proficient at other things. So they've been exposed. They've been exposed as not being the military geniuses, or having the peerless army that they told everybody that they had, but which, if you read internal reports coming from Israeli military commanders, particularly retired officers who were taking who were essentially doing assessments of Israeli military capacity, certainly after the war against Hezbollah in 2006, various different Israeli commanders had come out and said the army's not good enough. The army can't fight real wars anymore. And even some will say that the rock goes all the way back to at least the early 1980s. So they've, as I say, the war in Gaza has exposed them as militarily incompetent. And of course, it has rendered a significant defeat on them, because they not only can't win on the ground, but they've been revealed to have been committing crimes on a vast scale that has not been exposed as thoroughly as it has been until now. If you watched the scenes from the Great March of Return several years ago, which was this entirely peaceful march towards the border fence, you can see exactly what the Israelis take great joy in doing, which is murder on a vast scale. But again, that was nowhere near as high profile as this, and was covered briefly in the news, but not as much as this. Now you have endless amounts of video coming out of Gaza showing the horrors that the Israeli colonial forces have committed. And again, this has been severely damaging for the Zionist project on an international level, and damaging for its patron, US imperialism. So they strike at this consular building out of weakness, out of us wishing to be seen to be doing something. They also are powered by the fact that there are myriad contradictions inside the Israeli cabinet which can't be resolved, various different political forces vehemently disagreeing with each other, all, getting on board for some serious acts of brutality, but to varying different degrees of, should we say, aggressiveness, and to varying different degrees of what kind of brutality they should engage in. And as it becomes clear they can't win, and in fact, even according to now articles in newspapers like Haaretz, the liberal Israeli press, are acknowledging that not only are they losing, but they are losing badly. And so they do this for reasons that I'm sure will become more clear over time. Maybe it was a wish to appear to be strong. Maybe they thought that the Iranians wouldn't dare to hit them back. And perhaps they had a reasonable expectation of that, because, as you know, if you followed the course of Israeli and Iranian shadow wars, the Israelis have been assassinating and murdering Iranian scientists and Iranian officials for many, many years now. There's strong indications that they've had quite a bit to do with terrorist attacks inside Iran itself. They, of course, were all in on the Trump-led plot to assassinate Qasem Soleimani. And though Trump boasted about it, he said that Bibi got cold feet. He got cold feet. He backed off. And they... So when they must have looked at this, they thought, well, we'll kill this group of IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps officers, and we've done this before. We've killed military leaders, we've killed civilian officials, we've killed scientists. Maybe we can do this, look good, assert our dominance over Iran, and Iran won't do anything. But of course, first law, or one of the first laws of Marxism, as we understand it on this channel, is that everything is in constant motion. Nothing stays still. What might have been doable for Israel in the past is not doable anymore, due to many different reasons. But the two principal reasons are that, of course, Israel's position has been weakened. Its sponsors' positions have been weakened, i.e. the US and its bloc allies. And also, the position of Iran has strengthened over time. 20 years ago, Iran was relatively isolated. It had trading relationships with some countries, but is not in the position that it is in now, which is that it has entered the BRICS alliance. That's immeasurably improved its position. Its economic position has improved. It has proved itself to be an innovator when it comes to military technology in the form of drone and ballistic missile technology. It has developed a very competent, apparently, air defense system, and is now in the process of technological exchanges with both the Russians and the Chinese. It has now solidified its alliance with both of the other superpower nations in the world, the Russians and the Chinese, to the point now where any kind of US invasion, even if the US were capable of putting together a force and carrying this out, would be defeated before it even got going. And this is not a weak nation. This is not an isolated nation. You can't do these things to Iran now and expect no consequences. The Israelis, through a combination of desperation and the remaining arrogance that they have in thinking that when it comes to Iran, the Americans will automatically back them up, that led them into making a mistake. And it's a mistake that ultimately, when it comes to the missile strikes by Iran on Israel, has led to them becoming perceived now accurately as being ever weaker, because the Iranians essentially gave them fair warning that they were going to do this. There was apparently some kind of bartering going on, or attempt at bartering through the intermediaries in Oman between the Americans and the Iranians, but the Americans seem to have been told quite clearly to happen, and therefore they'd better get used to the idea. And so what I think has gone on here is that the Iranians said, we're going to strike back in a proportional fashion to the offense that's been given to us, and therefore we will do so. And so they did on the Saturday night. They launched many, apparently what was the biggest drone launch at Israel anywhere in the world. And these drone launches were designed to essentially test the Israeli air defenses. Now, it's worth emphasizing that what this exposed, this mass launch of drones and older missiles at Israel, was essentially, it was a giant test of the Israelis' air defense systems, which of course is the wildly overhyped and very expensive Iron Dome system, the so-called David Sling system, and various others that are provided mostly by the United States. But additionally, you had very advanced US Air Force radar systems, apparently based in the Negev desert, that were aiding Israel. And when it comes to shooting down the drones and missiles, not only was it the Israeli Air Force being active and the Israeli air defense being active wasn't enough. They had to mobilize the US Air Force, assets of the US Navy, the British Air Force, the French Air Force, and of course the Air Force of the Comprador King of Jordan, the wretched Abdullah, a man who likes to be pictured with an automatic weapon, but who was memed comprehensively at the weekend by somebody superimposing his face on the body of an Israeli general, because essentially that's what he exists to do. He exists to the Jordanian Comprador kings exist to protect the interests of imperialism. And so when they're ordered to defend Israel, defending Israel is exactly what they do. There's rumors also that the Saudis were involved in the defense of Israel, but they're keeping very quiet about the whole affair, and apparently whatever they did, they don't want it publicized, but it's not even confirmed that they were involved. So this has exposed the Jordanian king for being what he is, which is a wretched comprador swine. It's exposed Israel as not being able to defend itself, because they couldn't withstand this Iranian missile strike without assistance from 4 other countries at least. And it's now acknowledged that the Iranians exposed the air defense system as being incapable of standing up to the kind of assault that the Iranians can provide. And ultimately, they hit their targets. The 2 targets they actually wanted to hit, they did, which is the Nevatin and the Ramon Air Force bases in Israel, which were the 2 places where the attack on the Iranian consulates in Damascus were launched and coordinated from. So, and those were hit with more capable Iranian ballistic missiles. So this was a successful strike because they hit exactly what they wanted to hit. They exposed the Israeli air defense system as not being good enough to actually counter what, even just a fraction of what Iran can launch. And also they forced the backers of Israel to come out from behind the cover to secure their colony. And this has been a victory that has reinforced what the Palestinian National Liberation Forces did on October the 7th, which was when you saw the response of the Europeans and the United States in scrambling forces to prop up Israel. You saw clearly what the forces involved in this were, which is that Israel has no independent existence outside of being a tool for imperialism. It cannot handle any kind of stress outside of the normal course of just brutalizing civilians in the West Bank and Gaza. It can't handle being attacked from the outside by a powerful state, and Iran is a powerful state. And so the Iranians have really exposed it, together with exposing the puppet king in Jordan, and exposed the fact that without the United States in particular, Israel is not capable of defending itself. So this confirms what we have been saying here since October the 7th, and a bit before that as well. But really since October the 7th, the point I have been making over and over again is that Israel isn't a real place at all. It is a foul and contemptible outpost of US imperialism, and like all the outposts of US imperialism, rests on a foundation of brutality and also breeds within it the worst kind of colonial attitudes, genocidal impulses, and of course is a place for all manner of debased activities and criminality. For instance, Israel, which again, comes from the Israeli press, is a world refuge for sex offenders of all disgusting varieties, pedophiles, rapists, all kind of criminals, and of course is a world center for the porn industry. So this is the wonderful place that the liberals all run to defend, a center of criminality, sexual exploitation, violence, extreme racism, and everything else that goes with being a settler colonial society. When a society is based on the forcible suppression of a population which has to be displaced, but not just displaced, but continually humiliated and abused, where rape is institutionalized as a weapon to be used against that suppressed population. As many Israeli soldiers and ex-soldiers, even just on Twitter, will admit the things that they did in their so-called operations in the West Bank and Gaza. They'll admit to mass rapes casually, because apparently you can just admit to mass rape casually in the Israeli army or in Israeli society. So is it any wonder that a state which is built in that fashion would become a refuge for every perverted and deranged weirdo on the planet who can claim residence there? Not a surprise at all, as it turns out. So the question now is, well, what happens following the attack? Apparently the US imperialists urged Netanyahu to not do anything, basically saying, yeah, you've got away with this one without any further damage, so let's not go any further for now. The US imperialists can't fight at the moment a wider war in the Middle East. They can't fight a war against Iran and come out with it and look as if they will get anywhere close to winning. Plus, any war against Iran will cause world oil prices to spike, which will cause an economic disaster inside the imperialist bloc itself. They all know this, which is why they're shouting and screaming but not doing anything at the moment. The Israelis are, of course, under internal domestic political pressure to, quote-unquote, do something. But as to whether they do and what they do, that's another question. They seem to be horrifically split amongst themselves as to what the way forward is. You have Herzog, the president, saying that Israel doesn't seek a wider war with Iran. You have various different lunatics inside the cabinet saying, yes, we do. And you have the US imperialists in the background saying, don't go there right now. So what will win out is the question. Will the imperialists ultimately have to come out and tell the Israelis, no, you can't do it, or tell them that in private? Are they prepared to do that? Because if they do that, if Netanyahu now lets this pass with little or no response, then that is him diminished. That is his political stock, shriveled inside Israel. However, if they do something, and the Iranians now have a whole lot of data following the missile launches over the weekend about what the Israeli, American, British, French, and Jordanian air defense system is like around Israel, and what they need to do to overwhelm it even further than they did the other day, well, they can launch much more devastating assaults. They've made the point now that they can hit almost anywhere inside Israel itself, and that the Israeli air defense can't stop them. And when you think about it this way, it's a profound symbol of the now diminished status of the Zionist colonial state, that the Iranians have not only survived the worst that the American imperialists can throw at them, but can now hit directly at Israel, the US colonial project in the Middle East, and have the US tell the Israelis better not take it any further. You can see now that the world is changing around us, and that what's labeled as the axis of resistance in the Middle East is actually slowly winning this encounter. It's not an easy one by any means, and it comes with a horrible cost attached to it, but you can see the weakening of Israel and the weakening of the US imperialists themselves through this encounter, and the fact that the Iranians are ready to go much further if they feel the need to. They've done just enough to make a point so far, but they've clearly shown to the US imperialists that they can go much further if they chose to. That's why. But then again, Netanyahu and the Israeli cabinet are now damned if they do and damned if they don't. If they do strike back, then the Iranians will come back at them with another much more devastating strike. If they don't, then their own political stock will plummet through the floor with their own supporters, and they'll be screwed politically. Either way, severely weakens Netanyahu and his cabinet of crazies. And not only that, we get admissions now from inside the Israeli government. Probably, my guess would be from some in the military or some in the Israeli state bureaucracy, that if they live streamed the cabinet meetings on YouTube, that there would be 4 million departures from Israel overnight, because it's that divisive, it's that foul-tempered, it's that disorganized, it's that chaotic. I mean, if you televise British cabinet meetings, basically everybody would just get bored to death and fall asleep. But these ones seem to be verging on like brawls, apparently, come close to it. Various cabinet ministers threatening each other. Like, this is a state that's on the way down. And the only question now is, well, how quickly before it falls completely? So we will now pause for comments from the floor. Right, where are we? Sammy says, the whole world has seen what Iran is like and they are clapping with joy. Very true. Certainly most of the world. AJ Williamson says, if you watch the whole interview, Kay Burley fawned over Cameron. Well, this seems to be the standard operating procedure for the bourgeois press. They'll give them 9/10 of a fawning interview, and maybe then they'll throw in one decent question. But, you know, the fact that she asked that and he basically went, and looked like a complete idiot, that renders the rest of the interview irrelevant now, because that's what that interview is going to be remembered for. Whether Kay Burley meant it to go that way or not is another question, but that's the meme moment. Somebody called Jay says, Iran forces women to wear black plastic trash bags, hijab on their heads. It says everything. Well, your ability to construct a coherent sentence says everything. The fact that you don't possess that ability says everything. But let's move on from grammatical and syntax corrections, perhaps, and move to your point. Trash bags? Well, that's not true, is it? And also, what does it say everything? What does it say, Jay, if you're still watching? What does it actually say? Because you haven't said what you're accusing the Iranians of there, what it says about their society. So why don't you spell it out? Why don't you say exactly what it means in the comments, Jay? As to this claim that not just our commenter friend here is making, but others have made as well, that, oh, well, you can't possibly support the actions of Iran because, you know, insert a reason A, B, and C. Now, from the Liberals, this complaint is just hypocritical bullshit, given the number of unsavory characters that that Liberal politicians associate with, given that Liberal politicians have armed and funded Salafist groups who are infinitely worse than the actions of the Islamic Republic of Iran internally. But I would also say this to the so-called communists out there who are apparently unable to grasp the law of constant motion, which is that the Iranian state, the Islamic Republic of Iran, can be many things at once. As far as, and this is our attitude, as far as Iran opposes the primary contradiction in the entire world right now, which is the fading but dangerous power of US imperialism, then Iran plays a progressive role in the world. Now, this isn't to rule out anything else that goes on inside Iran in terms of contradictions and antagonisms there, but you cannot look at the world in a reasonable way, whether you are a Marxist or not, and deny that the primary problem facing it is the power, on the diminishing power and the attempt to retain that power that US imperialism is, and the process it is engaged in all the way around the world of trying to reinforce itself and failing, but causing mass casualties as it fails. And so as far as Iran goes in opposing the power of US imperialism in the Middle East, as far as Iran goes in supporting movements that aid in national liberation, like Ansar Allah in Yemen, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, like the Palestinian Combined National Liberation Forces in Gaza and elsewhere, then Iran is playing a progressive role in that respect. With regard to the contradiction, those will resolve themselves according to the actions of the Iranian working class. But the only way that those are going to be able to be resolved in a progressive fashion is if the power of US imperialism and its compradors is gone or diminished to the point where they can no longer affect things. That way, the contradictions and antagonisms inside Iran and many other countries that are resisting imperialism right now can play out in a proper fashion without being distorted or manipulated by imperialism. We should welcome the progressive role that Iran plays in supporting national liberation movements and supporting the Palestinian cause. And I will be unashamed in saying that. I think, Jay, that you're just a dirty, racist, Zionist weirdo who should crawl back into your basement. So kindly now, fuck off and remove yourself. In fact, I'll do it for you. Goodbye and good afternoon. Right. Apparently there was a problem with the volume. Do let me know if it's corrected now. Yes, Yuan. Cameron is nowhere near as sharp as Blair. Yeah, he's the Tony Blair, but badly photocopied. Dan Deasy says, hello, didn't Iranian students together during the revolution take some US hostages, and from that day to this, the US has never forgiven them, plowed on sanctions and supported the MEK and threatens war? Yeah, there's the hostage taking is part of it. That's like caused a grudge within the American intelligence world, but also it's the fact that the Iranian government and the various different forces inside Iran, their far bigger crime from the US imperialists' point of view is their assertion of Iranian sovereignty and independence. Iranian sovereignty and independence, which of course have been compromised and then destroyed by US and British imperialism in the early 1950s with the removal of Mossadegh. And that nationalist current reasserted itself via the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Of course, it was a revolution that took place on a bourgeois nationalist basis, so of course had a strong anti-communist streak in it, and indeed communists were killed by the Iranian government in the 1980s. Of course, that doesn't change the objectively progressive role that Iran has played in several different struggles inside the West Asian region. And this is the reason why, these are the reasons why US imperialism continues to desperately work for the overthrow of the Iranian government and the Iranian system, but can't find a way to do it. They tried they tried with Saddam Hussein, first of all, and the Baathists in Iraq, and manipulated the situation that existed there between Iraq and Iran, tried to have, or hoped to weaken Iran to the point where the Islamic Republic system collapsed, and that ultimately failed. They tried via sanctions for years, and that ultimately failed. They've tried via various different terrorist actions, and that's not worked. So nothing that they've done has been able to uproot the Islamic Republic that was built out of the 1979 revolution. It's Iranian sovereignty and independence which bothers them. And that would bother them whether this was the Khomeinist system, which exists there now, or whether this was some kind of more secular nationalist system. It's not the treatment of women. It's not the treatment of homosexuals. It's not any of the so-called human rights concerns that the US blabbers on about. Those aren't matters that really concern US imperialism at all. Those are just tools to be used against Iran. What really concerns them is the fact that Iran escaped their grip. That's what concerns them. Now, I can hear somewhere, perhaps characters on certain Trotskyite websites claiming that, well, Iran's capitalist. Yeah, well, it most certainly is, but it's not. It's a capitalist nation that resists US imperialism, and therefore it plays a progressive role in the world. But some will, of course, obviously claim that Iran has characters in it who want to do a deal with imperialism. And that is true to some degree. There will be reactionaries inside the Iranian system who might favor a deal with imperialism. In fact, they've tried. under so-called moderate presidencies to make a deal with US imperialism. Much like the Russians, though, and much like the Chinese, the Iranian so-called moderate group have been weakened precisely because US imperialism will accept no deal, even from the so-called Iranian moderates, that does not involve the complete capitulation of Iran and the reversal of the assertion of sovereignty and independence that the 1979 revolution brought about. Right. Gela Nikolov says, IDF is a pampered army. They can't stand up to Al-Quds, let alone to Hezbollah. That's very true. Hello to Ben, who's joined us. And HM asks, is there any chance Israel will attack Iran without US support? Do they have independent control of their nukes? I don't know about the latter question. I need to find that out. In fact, I will note that down to look into further. I don't think that what if we think about it this way, other than like launching a fucking nuke, which Israel's not going to do without the US fully behind them, and the US would not be fully behind them for that. The Israelis can try and attack Iranian assets in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, perhaps. The Yemenis would try and shoot them down, or Iraq. So they could do that. They could attack Iran directly. But again, without US support, that's very dodgy. They're on very, very shaky ground. Because if they attack Iran, and especially if they cause mass casualties, which, you know, the Israelis love to do, then the Iranian response would be quite overwhelming in when they come back on that. And again, without US support, then what can the Israelis really do? So again, the Israelis are stuck. If they do, as I said, if they attack Iran, then the Iranian response will be devastating and will most likely go after Israeli military capacity, which is what they did this time. They avoided any attack on civilian infrastructure, any civilian targets at all. Complete contrast, of course, to the behavior of the Israelis and, of course, the US imperialists themselves. Ben says, with regard to Israel, pretty much everyone in the world, friend and foe alike, warned the Israelis not to attack Iran. If they do, it's their funeral, quite literally in this case. Oh, apparently Klaus Schwab has been hospitalized. Does he have his own private hospital inside that volcano lair he lives in? Good morning to Martin, who's joining us from the United States. Ben says Abdullah summoned the Iranian ambassador over unfair statements. Yeah, he's the pissing and moaning about from the Jordanians is quite unimpressive. The fact that they have been caught out supporting the Israelis directly has made them a little sour, apparently. But this is the nature of Jordan. This is the nature of the Jordanian monarchy. It's why the British founded it. It's why the King of Jordan was, of course, schooled in Sandhurst, like every good old-fashioned British colonial puppet regime. Svetlana says, or asks, was the kibbutz scheme truly socialist as we have been told, or is that some BS covering some other BS? Yeah, it's garbage. It was never a socialist system. It was always colonial. It was basically the social democratic cover for colonial occupation. That's what it was. It never had any socialist content to it. It was never progressive in the slightest. It was just marketed that way to fool pro-imperialist social democrats who didn't need much fooling in Europe and especially the United States into backing Israel. Everything they've done, that they've done in terms of marketing, is all about, you know, securing support for themselves inside Europe and the United States. And in the period where the socialist change was very popular, they of course marketed themselves in that way. David Greenwood says to myself that I, along with the two Greek Alexanders on the Duran, are on my favorite geopolitical analysis at this tragic but transforming moment. Well, glad that you're getting something out of this program. Good to have you with us, David. Ben says it was such a huge sea change, lots of old truths laid bare. Therefore, 4/14/2024 also came out of the blue like 10/7, 2023, and 2/24, 2022 beforehand. That's all in American, of course, date-wise. But that's very correct. It only comes out of the blue if you're not paying attention to the movements under the surface. Sammy says, or asks rather, what do you predict will happen if the nutters in the Israeli government decide to strike Iran directly? Yeah, well, I would say if they do that, then that's the suicide option. Because if they strike at Iran directly, it's going to lead to probably widespread casualties, unlike the Iranian strike. And the Iranians will respond with a much more heavy missile barrage that completely overwhelms the Israeli air defense systems and, again, goes after very significant military targets, would be my guess. And it would very much damage the Israeli war-making capacity. That would be what it would be designed to do, I think. So any further strike would only escalate the crisis in terms of Israel getting hammered on its military side by the Iranians, and would only further weaken Israel. But again, they're stuck. Like, Netanyahu can't go forward and can't go backwards. The only way out is down, and the only way out for the Israelis now is ultimately going to end with the dissolution of the Israeli state. There will be no two-state solution. Any Israeli state which would be left after a two-state solution would essentially have to be disarmed and have its nuclear weapons taken away from it. The only thing that's left now is collapse. So, Not a Pacifist says, the Greek Alexanders have good information but are far from the left. Well, I'd say they're basically liberals in outlook. Honest liberals, but liberals nonetheless. Hood in Shirt says, Iran proved the Iron Dome can't stand up to a war of attrition. IDF spent $1 billion to counter Iran's $5 million worth of dummy drones to deplete the Iron Dome before launching their cruise and ballistic missiles. Yeah, very true. Eric Schmidt says, my home country, Sweden, which under Olof Palme was in the non-aligned movement, criticized Vietnam War. Israel has now become neoconservative. In 2022, I did not vote. I didn't have a referendum on NATO. Well, the fate of Sweden and Finland reveals the lie of the Nordic social democratic model. Like, it's completely degenerated into becoming a US puppet state. Well, both of them have now. They didn't vote on it. They didn't debate it. They just joined NATO because essentially the US ordered them to. So Sweden and Finland are not independent countries. Not truly. Not anymore. Let's see. Tony says, glad to see when you are live. It seems Israel has the only option left of invading Rafah or not, or triggering that war with Iran. They may just be that crazy. Well, if they invade Rafah, that again escalates the crisis, because that will further provoke regional responses in the populations. I mean, the reputation of the Jordanian comprador regime is sinking under the water right now. So, and if they are now seen to have defended a Israeli regime which is now determined to carry out another massacre in Rafah, and indeed will carry out another massacre in Rafah if it is allowed to, then that'll compromise the compromise in a fundamental way the security and stability of the Jordanian regime, possibly the Egyptian one as well, though they seem to have stayed out of the events over the weekend. So again, like, the Israeli crisis is threatening to drag down all of the US and British comprador regimes with it. Again, there's no positive way forward for them. They can't find a way out of this. If they don't do anything, then that government collapses. But any government that comes in after it, whether it's led by Lapid or Naftali Bennett if he comes back, or Benny Gantz or whoever it is going to be left with a severe problem. And they'll have like a very divided population between those who want to go full-blown war against everybody, those who favor limited war, those who favor a move towards a more openly religious style of dictatorship, and those who want to preserve the facade of a sort of Western liberal state. So they are riven with contradictions, and they are stuck. They can't get out of this. The best way for this to end would be the implosion of the Israeli state, the leaving of occupied Palestine by the settlers from the United States and Europe, their return to their homelands, and those who can't go anywhere else having to reach a bargain with the Palestinian population to live in harmony in a unified state, as should always have been the case. Again, there's no way out. There's no saving Israel. Like the Russians and the Chinese keep offering the two-state solution, but it's never going to happen. It's not going to be able to happen. Even if they managed to push it to the point where it was, you set up a Palestinian and Israeli state, that Israeli state that within the 1947 borders would immediately just go insane. Like, it would be unstable. It would be unable to actually function. It would be filled with like some of the worst maniacs you could possibly imagine, and it would be perpetually at odds with any Palestinian state that was established there. You'd have to have like a giant peacekeeping force between the two, because the remaining Israeli state will keep constantly trying to attack a Palestinian state. So this isn't, again, I will reiterate, this doesn't end except with the dissolution of the Israeli state. There's no other way to handle it. Wayne says, what's your assessment on the Ba'ath Party and the state of pan-Arabism in North Africa and the Middle East in general? Well, Ba'athism, I don't know what the current state of play of like Ba'athism across the Middle East is. Previously quite a powerful movement, but with some very deep flaws to it, given that it was principally in Syria and Iraq, based in a lot of its strength was based in like free officer movements, officer corps movements. It did have something of a mass base, but often came to power in Iraq and in Syria via maneuvers within the military. Has a degree of mass support, certainly in Syria now, and in Iraq in the past. Did vary, I mean, even the Saddam era saw quite a lot of progressive things done in Iraq, so you must acknowledge that. But again, very contradictory. Like, people say that the Iranian regime is contradictory and anti-communist. Well, the Iraqi regime was anti-communist. They killed, don't know if they killed as many communists as the Iranians did in the 80s, but Saddam certainly oversaw the killing of many communists in the 70s. And they were part of the non-aligned movement. So again, like, this is a movement with a very mixed past. Overall progressive, and overall, like, we certainly should have defended Baathism in Iraq against US imperialism without a doubt, but has a very shaky history. And I think a part of that is the fact that it was rooted in, if not minority areas, such as it wasn't a mass movement of the Arab peasants and worker populations. It was a movement of the educated middle class more, quite a lot of the time, and that, I think that kind of limited it. As to pan-Arabism today, I'm not sure of its strength. I think that the general spirit of it survives, but there's no figure of a comparable stature to Nasser. Perhaps, you know, al-Houthi in Yemen, maybe, but he's from a relatively small and relatively poor state. We will have to see what happens with things shaking out from the decline and fall of Israel and the decline and fall of US imperialism in the region. Maybe some new pan-Arab movement will emerge out of this. We'll have to see. But if you want more on Baathism, I can do something on it in the near future. Have Iran, China, and Russia got a security agreement? There is one between Iran and Russia that was under discussion recently. I think that was signed. So there is one between those two. I don't know if there's a formal one between the Chinese and the Iranians, but the Chinese have extensive relations with Iran, even if they've not signed a security agreement. But yeah, they've got one with Russia, certainly. The only real socialist state that has ever existed is the kibbutz I lived in during my time in Israel, says Noam Chomsky. Great quote to dig out there from Wayne, very true. Proving that Chomsky doesn't understand anything about socialism, and he dares to criticize the Soviet Union. My God. Israel is apparently crying at the UN Security Council about how Iran endangered civilians. Yeah, well, self-awareness is not one of their gifts. Anomalous says, I feel as though history is accelerating rapidly due to the incredible strike by Iran. The American proletariat is waking up faster than expected. Well, the American proletariat is waking up, as is the British proletariat, to the knowledge that it is being relentlessly scammed. All the things they told you would be possible in your life are now being rendered impossible by the price gouging and profiteering of the capitalist class, and everybody can see it. Varoufakis got banned in Germany. Yeah, the most radical thing that's ever happened to him. Shame he wasn't banned from Germany when he was finance minister. Noam Chomsky has never been anything other than an overinflated archivist. That's quite an apt description. HM says, has the US put on hold any moves on Taiwan due to the crisis in the Middle East, or will it speed up aggression against China out of desperation? Well, the moves on Taiwan are a curious one because they want to be able to carry out aggression against China, but it seems to me that they don't want to risk their own ground forces in doing so. They seem to want to, that is the US, wants to have the Taiwanese and possibly Japan do the fighting, and possibly the Filipinos. And the US provides like the weapons and the naval support and possibly the air support. But they don't want to risk their own army because it would get blown up very quickly. So that the plan with all of these wars was always to try and destabilize Russia, destabilize China and Iran ultimately, by getting them to engage in wars that would bog them down. And with the combination of sanctions and political pressure and possibly like color revolution activities, the idea was that they would be then destabilized to the point of whether they had to give up or whether or that the existing government would fall. None of that's going to work. So this is a problem for the US, but again, like they can't stop going forward with the destabilization campaign they're trying to wage on China, using Taiwan as a tool. But the Taiwanese proletariat are the ones who can answer this, which is that if one of the compradors in Taipei decides that he's going to go for it and declare independence and dare Beijing to do something, then whoever that is needs to be removed from power by an uprising immediately. Because like what has the Taiwanese proletariat got to gain from these clowns and traitors who are at the service of US imperialism, who are trying to divide China against itself? Like anybody who tries to give himself the title of the Taiwanese Zelensky needs to be shown the door, because you're seeing what the first version of Zelensky has wrought in Ukraine. Nothing but ruin and death. Geli Nikolov says, I'm watching Turkey at the moment. Yeah, interesting to see what that rat Erdogan does. James Goblin says, just testing the holy Twitter chat. Well, you're coming in loud and clear. Chomsky the anarcho-socialist. Well, yes, that's fun, isn't it? Ben asked, what do you think about the insanely huge use of interceptors, Patriot missiles, and its effects on other conflicts, i.e. Ukraine. Kuleba is now basically trying to extort the US for gear. Well, he's not going to be able to get what the US doesn't have to give him. I mean, they keep saying send more Patriots, send more Patriots. There's not actually, according to what I've seen, an awful lot more to send. They'll send them more to Israel than they will to Ukraine. I mean, if you look at the bourgeois press's analysis of the Ukraine story, they're now openly admitting that the defeat is on the way. They're basically they're basically getting to the point where they're prepared to say, look, we're losing this one. Putin's still bad, but time to get out. Now, what they would like to do is to find themselves a way to get out without looking like they've lost. I doubt the Russians will give them that. They're saying now that basically Kiev has to surrender without reservation, so to speak. So that's clearly something which is going to be damaging. But there's also why they will prioritize Israel for Patriots. Kuleba can whine all he likes, but he's not going to be getting it. If Israel is on the downslope, then the priority of the US will be to secure that and their position in the Middle East, not to secure a losing cause, which is what the Kiev regime now is. It's a losing cause and everybody can see it, even in the bourgeois political systems. Nick Hall says, what makes your opinion more valid than Chomsky regarding the definition of socialism? Success, Nick. Success. The successful building of workers' states in, well, the Soviet Union, the success of the planned economy, which Chomsky abhors, the success of the revolution in China, which Chomsky abhors, the success of the Cuban Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, the decolonization wars, which Chomsky sort of only half-heartedly supports. All of that is the tradition to which I and many others belong. And all of that is infinitely more successful at liberating people than the vague anarchism of Mr. Chomsky, who is essentially nothing more than the acceptable left, the face of the acceptable left in the United States. His anarchism is a bunch of crap, basically. It's just phony radicalism designed to be acceptable in US academia. Look at all the great success that anarchism has had over the years. I'll give you 10 seconds. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Have you finished looking yet? There isn't any. And by the way, their biggest chance in Spain, they completely bollocksed it up. So I would advise you to look again at anarchism and look again at Chomsky. Chomsky is the phase we all go through. Everybody picks up a Chomsky book and thinks, wow, that's amazing. And you read and read his critiques and you find that he only ever has critiques. His political pronunciations are all reactionary. He's, for all of his criticisms of US military actions, he's told his readers and followers to vote for people like John Kerry, people like Joe Biden. So again, like, if you're going to criticize all US military actions, which he has done, but you're going to tell people ultimately in the United States that you've got to vote for John Kerry or Joe Biden to stop, whatever they're calling the Republicans this week, that's a joke. You render your critiques meaningless by doing so, because you perpetuate the system which, of course, delivers the very brutish military actions he later critiques. So his politics are garbage, useless, nonsense. And of course, you throw in a good unhealthy dose of Western chauvinism to boot with Chomsky. So Chomsky can go fucking do one as far as I'm concerned. As Ben points out, Chomsky, an anarcho-socialist, not really, more anarcho than socialist, who wanted to remove all the unvaxxed to internment camps without any access to food. Actually, it is very anarcho, because anarchism slips over into fascism very quickly. Eric says the weakness of an absurdly overcomplicated and expensive US military gear designed to overwhelm goat herder nations like Afghanistan is being exposed as cheaper drones and missiles. As cheaper drones and missiles swamp the Iron Dome. Been exposed in Ukraine for 2 years now. And it didn't work in Afghanistan either. Like, it blew up and it killed a lot of people, but they still lost the war, you know? It's, over-designed garbage. I mean, we were talking just the other night about the British so-called nuclear bomb. You get they spend a lot of money and they end up buying things which barely function, because this is the nature of degenerated capitalist systems that exist in the imperialist countries now. Geli Nikolov says, my mates were anarchists as kids, now bought into the petty bourgeois. Well, that's the way. You can be an anarchist is a very acceptable way to be a so-called rebel in the West. Now you can be that, and you can go and join an insurance company, and they'll probably think it looks quite good on your resume. Yuan says, Chomsky will not mind recruiting the CIA to save Rojava. Well, it never did. I mean, they saved Rojava and turned it into a hiding place for the US military, various different secret services, and Israel. So that's not going to save Rojava, is it, in the end? As I'm sure you're implying in your comment there. Okay. Right. James Goblin says, Chomsky equals a celebrity millionaire anarchist telling us to vote Biden. Yep, that's a good sentence-long definition. Svetlana says, Chomsky, the last gasp of the 60s would-be radicals. Yep. Anomalous says, the question about the definition of socialism makes me think of H.G. Wells telling Stalin, the leader of the most powerful communist state at the time, what the definition of socialism is. Yes, H.G. Wells never lacked for an ego. Be sure to read the dialogue between Stalin and H.G. Wells. It's very instructive in that Wells comes across as a bit of a moron, and Stalin demonstrates how well-read he is. Pashtun tribalism defeated the US imperialists. That's true. All their expensive equipment didn't work. Largest success of anarchism, Chaz, Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. It lasted a month, I think. Yeah, and that was allowed to exist by the state. I think it's pretty fucking obvious when you're looking at this, like, why that the autonomous zones, was it Chaz and something else were allowed to exist in 2020? Like, the same reason Black Lives Matter was promoted by the state. It was to basically do destabilization operations in an election year for various different reasons, some of which were anti-Trump, some of which were pro-Trump. It was the state playing games, basically. Yeah, that's the success of anarchism in the United States. I'm surprised Chomsky didn't go there, or at least zoom in for a meeting. How about this for irony, says Putin's shirt, when Afghanistan was under Soviet influence, the Soviets initiated education for girls. Now, 4 decades later, the West screams at Afghanistan for lack of education for girls. Yeah, because they don't give a fuck about education for women, women's rights, any other rights you want to mention that they complain about with regard to Afghanistan or Iran or anybody else. Doesn't mean anything to them. Bear in mind, they were prepared to have Syria, which was a secular state, with a decent degree of rights for women. Not saying it was perfect, but a relatively secular state which had, the Baathists had there actually done a lot to advance the rights of women, as did Nasser in Egypt, as did the Baathists in Iraq. And the US imperialists were prepared to have it handed over to ISIS, who were infinitely worse than anything the Khomeinists did or have done in Iran. So this is what women's rights mean to them. Nothing. Nothing. It's just a tool. It's something to whip up the petty bourgeois and the labor aristocracy in our own countries to get them on board with regime change operations. Then you dig into the regime change operation and you find out who's doing the fighting. Ukrainian fascists, how are they on women's rights? Salafists in Libya and Syria and Iraq and various other places, how are they on women's rights? Same Salafists or similar bunch like Al-Qaeda in Bosnia, destroying the remnants of Yugoslav socialism as it was in Kosovo. Like, they plaster liberal slogans and identity politics slogans over these regime change operations, and you scrape away the surface, and as no bourgeois press will ever do, of course, you dig into it and you find who's doing the actual dirty work. What, fascists, Salafists, gangsters, drug barons, you name a reactionary, ultra-violent group, and they're the ones doing the dirty work. And so, yeah, please tell me, US imperialism, about how much you care about the rights of women when those are your allies, and the havens, the imperialist havens, the colonial states that you run in Ukraine, in Kosovo, in Israel, as we said, havens really for every type of degenerate criminal, degenerate sex offender anywhere in the world will find their home in Kosovo, Israel, or Ukraine. This is what they do to all the countries that they turn into puppet regimes. This is the nature of imperialism. And we could spend probably about 6 hours talking about this on an economic, political, and psychological level. But that's what they do. So do not listen to them for a minute. Listen to them, in fact, only to refute them. And if anybody says, well, what about women's rights? Point this out in anybody in your workplace, in your community, because this is all very well documented. Just get them to read the Max Blumenthal book, Management of Savagery, because that spells it all out. The Syrian war is a good means to understand this. Get them to read the Michael Parenti book on the death of Yugoslavia. You know, this is their alliance with these most ultra-reactionary, violent forces in the world is very well documented by now. They've even admitted to it in the past. So, you know, this isn't something to be taken seriously. Hassan Piker loves Chomsky. I'm sure he does. Did Chomsky join him in that brothel he visited? Maybe that's why they're friends. H.G. Wells also wanted to wipe out millions of working class people. Yeah, H.G. Wells' politics were borderline fascist. He played around with socialism, but he was a eugenicist and an arsehole. Good writer, but you need to be aware of the rest of the man's legacy. Eric says the most rabid medieval terror groups are all Western created and backed. Yep, very deliberately so. Right, where are we now? I am dizzy with success. Joseph Stalin addressing Nick Hall, says Wayne. Humanity in its entirety does not mean anything to capital in its senility and decay phase. Yep, but without humanity there is no capital. Thomas says Chomsky blames Stalin for the Spanish Civil War failure, but didn't mention that the anarchists refused to follow orders and to be more cohesive as a military. Yeah, I mean, Chomsky is able to do that because Trotsky and the anarchists of the time basically wrote the script for him. If you look at the actual actions of the Communist Party of Spain and the Comintern, they were trying to organize the army on a more effective basis. They were trying to carry out political education on a more effective basis. The anarchists preferred to stay in like poorly armed militia groups, and also alienated large numbers of the peasants by going around and murdering large numbers of priests, which, given the record of the Roman Catholic Church in Spain as being on the side of reaction, you could understand some of the rage against it, but in actual fact, you ended up alienating more people than you ever possibly influenced in a positive way by doing that. So anarchism is a confused, ill-disciplined mess which wasted the lives and energy of a lot of workers in Spain because they proved incapable of responding properly to a changed situation. And of course, the Trots and the anarchists love the Spanish Civil War because it's a losing struggle. They don't like winning struggles. They're addicted to failure. Max Blumenthal is described as the fascist by Zionist. Well, that's an admission, isn't it? Frank says, some Afghan middle class equate Pakistan to the Israel project. I've seen that comparison made by Tariq Ali as well. I'd have to go back and look at that again to see it. Yeah, Tariq Ali does make that comparison in his book, The Clash of Fundamentalisms. I mean, I'd have to go back and reread it. It's been 20 years since I actually looked at it. But I found it interesting at the time. Okay, right. We have 211 of you watching. It is an hour and a half in, so I'm going to draw things to a close for today. I'll return to you tomorrow at the more regular time of 7:30 in the evening with an update on this story, because undoubtedly things are changing very quickly. But until then, I will say thank you to everybody who's contributed to the chat, and thank you to everybody who supports the program. on Patreon. This audio version of this will continue to be placed on there, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow. Thank you and good evening.